Yeah, hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you might be joining us today. We welcome you to continued conversation around the Kenya We Deserve series. Today, we are very privileged to have with us two panelists, great sons of Kenya, who will be engaged in this conversation, and we hope you will join us. But before we bring them on the screen, we want to ask you to do one favor for us on our Facebook page, KDRTV. Please go there and click subscribe so that you can always get notifications when and whenever we go live. Also, go on YouTube. We're available there live. Click subscribe so that you can continue to be part of us. And then also on TikTok. As we continue the conversation, please feel free to go on those platforms, post your question and or comment to make this conversation lively. Again, a keynote that this is a series that will be going on for quite some time. And anybody who's interested in being part of this conversation, please feel free to reach us. So today, I'm not only privileged, but very honored to have some of my best friends, the people I have nothing but tremendous respect to, who are going to help us with this. Coming up on here on the screen is Dr. Edwin Bugongo, a good friend of ours and a great son of Kenya, a great community contributor here in the state of Minnesota and also across the diaspora. Also with us is the soft-spoken, intelligent, and very likable Dr. Kenny Karanja, so very good in political analysis, joining us here. Gentlemen, nice to have you. Good to see you. If you could, I think for the sake of our viewers, we're just starting this conversation. If you could, for the sake of our viewers, just introduce yourselves whichever way you like. And I want to start with you. Ken, you're next to me on screen.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for having us on this call. As you mentioned, I'm Kenny Karanja, long form Kenneth, and I'm a long-term Kenyan in the diaspora, really committed to seeing Kenya move to the next level, progress both economically and politically, and I'm glad to be here to share what I think the diaspora can contribute to going forward. I'm based here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to have you, Kenny. Dr. Edwin.
Yeah, thanks, Prof, for having me as well. I am a physician here in the Minneapolis area as well, and obviously very concerned about healthcare in home country Kenya, in as far as how we are able to provide care to those that least afford it, and what kind of investments we make in the healthcare space. I think is going to be important for us to achieve universal healthcare. So I'm just very interested in sort of being part of that movement to make Kenya a little bit more ahead when it comes to the level of care Kenyans get. So thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you, Kenny. Thank you. So let's also acknowledge the man behind the screen. I think it would be unfair if we don't do so. Engineer Ben Kebwato is our boss, by the way. He's also a wonderful son of Kenya, a strategist, and who is committed to making sure that we do this. But for today's conversation, I think the title suggests the Kenya we deserve. We're going to focus on the diaspora preparedness for next year's elections. I think there's a lot of talk about what the country is doing in Kenya, but also it's important to spend a few minutes to talk about the role of the diaspora. We're talking about all those Kenyans here in the Americans, those Kenyans in Europe, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere around the world. How are they prepared for 2027? Must they even be focused on 2027, or must they be prepared on something else? So it's a conversation that we're going to have here. So let me begin with Ken again. I'll do this interchangeably. In your view, is it time for us to start talking about 2027, or are we way ahead of the game?
Right. That's a good question. I think the Kenyan diaspora has continually, in the diaspora we mean not just in the United States, but in Europe, Southeast Asia, and everywhere that Kenyans reside. I think they have been intimately engaged in matters governance and politics in Kenya. So it would not be surprising for me to see them already being engaged this far off from the next election, which is in August 2027. But having said that, I think the more substantive point is what's the quality of that engagement? What are they bringing to the table? Being so far out from an election, does it mean they should wait till there is an election, or they should be preparing and engaging even before that election? So The engagement, early engagement is good, but as we know, a day is a lifetime in politics. So it just depends on the quality of that engagement and what people are trying to establish and change in Kenya at any particular moment. So it's never too early, I would say.
Okay, Edwin, I would say it's too early. What are your thoughts?
I would say it's too late. I think as we head into an election season, one has to wonder whether our politicians necessarily have the right frame of mind to appreciate the role of the diaspora. I think it's one thing to necessarily say we believe in this or that. I think what's lacking is a very good grasp of what role the diaspora can play in shaping the country's future. I think politics is about elections, but I think this is 2026. If I use the analogy of Singapore versus Kenya, there has to be some consciousness that at some point the country has to be progressive. We have to progress, and that progress is measured in many ways, whether it's GDP, whether it's a quality of education, whether it's a quality of healthcare, and access to all sorts of things, and then how many people we take out of poverty, right? I think my thought is that we're behind in cementing that awareness in our political class about we're a really key resource if somebody cares to engage us.
Okay, good, thank you. So, talking about that, let's look at what the diaspora has been coined as for a very long time. We have a huge population of Kenyans all around the world, and as best as we know, I'd have argued this, and I'll continue to argue that the Kenyan diasporans are the best ambassadors our nation will probably ever have. You will see Kenyans, I mean, people working in the healthcare industry. You will see people in academia, people in technology, people in every business, in every walk of life, trying to present the very best of Kenya. However, Kenyan in the diaspora associated with remittances, how much money we spend, we send to the country, which is good, no problem. But the question for you two gentlemen is this enough reason for the Kenyan establishment to take the diaspora seriously? If so, how should they do that? Kenny?
Yeah, so I think we are at a point where we can say beyond remittances, because other than remittances, there are we provide technology transfer, for example, exchange of ideas, both cultural, economic, socio-political ideas. There are people, there are diasporans who run in Kenyan elections and win. So apart from just the remittances, which is what everyone and the government tends to focus on, I think there are other, I would call them soft remittances. They are not monetary remittances that would warrant our participation in Kenya's socioeconomic political progress. So yeah, remittances is just one thing, but money essentially moves everything. So there's usually a focus on remittances. But I believe the other things that the diasporans contribute to Kenya would necessitate their participation in Kenya's political development. In addition, the 2010 Constitution also provides a pathway for that particular participation. So beyond, even if we are remitting $0, our civic engagement is enshrined in the Constitution, and it is something that should be taken seriously. And I believe it is something that the diasporans do take seriously, hence this conversation, to find ways of pushing that idea. I think part of our engagement that I often ask myself is, are we contributing something different from what is there on the ground? This being a Sunday, I'm reminded of two words, ecumenical. Are we diasporans looking at Kenya as a whole, bringing the whole country together rather than being parochial, where people think about their regions and their communities and their tribes? Do we, as the diasporans, do we bring something beyond just remittances, or we are just remitting resources, but still remain in that tribal parochial cocoon that has really impeded Kenya's development? So money is one thing, but there are other things that the diasporans bring, and that those things should also drive their engagement in the socio-political conversation.
Well, those are good points, Kenny, but they always say politics is local, right? If it's politics is local, then there's that school of argument that will say leave politics for Kenyans in Kenya because they live the realities. The others will go ahead and argue, hey, you, the Major people, you live in a totally different reality. Your lifestyles in the diaspora is not the same as those ones in the villages across the country. And then others will argue, hey, you can't use your money or your financial power to dictate how we run our stuff in the local markets. So with that understanding, Edwin, then how do we make sure that we leverage that well?
Well, I would probably suggest that, in the olden days we used to write letters to spread information or to ask this or that. We evolved to email, and then we evolved to cell phones, and now we're in real time, either SMS. And so the social progress has nothing to do with where you exist on the planet. And if you can imagine, there's a reason why Kenya leading the way. Obviously, Africa has become sort of the hotbed for technological innovation. I don't think the goal is to change people's way of life as much as to improve the quality of life, right? I'll give you an analogy. If you live next to a stream that gives clean, healthy water, and you have lived there for 50 years and not figured out how you can secure that stream so that everybody in the village, for example, can benefit from that water, that has nothing to do with where you are. So if somebody from the investment has come across some very interesting technology that can benefit the community, why not engage those people so that they can give to the community something new, so that our kids are not leaving school and spending hours and then trying to go to the river in the village, and so on and so forth. So I think that, again, as I said earlier, it's got to be that our politicians appreciate that there's value add beyond remittances, right? I see a lot of my colleagues who go to Kenya with incredible new technology in the healthcare space to go and do missions, medical missions, right? Why? Because I have not found a Kenyan who does not have love of country. I've not found a Kenyan who is privileged enough who says, "How can I give back?" And what is that framework of giving back? So tech transfer exchanges. But I also think that if you have a national sort of strategy about diaspora resources, so by the end of this year, we probably might sniff $5 billion in remittance to the country, right? So, for example, can we focus on some of the challenges? And I'll just name a few. A lot of diasporans have tried to buy land and they have gotten defrauded. A lot of diasporans have bought properties and they have challenges trying to get those properties transferred to them. Some diasporans have invested in some of this, especially in the area of real estate developments that is happening, in an effort to say, let's contribute to this sort of national housing strategy. And then there's no framework for oversight, and these stories are everywhere. But I think the government can be more deliberate to say that, to mitigate this sort of loss of remittance into these sort of dead end situations where diasporans are losing money, can we have some very clear diaspora driven sort of sector investments, whether it's different types of diaspora bonds? It could be, I mean, we talk about Euro bond, and we talk about the government giving, asking for money from all over the place. I think there's a way. I think the country can say, we have this resource of people that are really, really interested in growing the country, and provide a framework for investment beyond buying land and putting up apartments, or farming and having very, very marginal ROI. So I agree with Dr. Karanja that the conversation beyond remittances should be, again, as I said earlier, a framework of engagement that the political class understand can add value to the country.
I mean, I can't agree more with you two gentlemen. Particularly, I've always argued that looking at the diaspora from the perspective of remittances, quite frankly, is an insult to our collective intelligence. And I think it's important, even for those ones who are working on behalf of the politicians and political parties in Kenya, to move away from the financial issue and focus on substance. So, for example, we do have, look at, with your permission, Dr. Bogongo, if I may mention, heading the Association of Medics in the state of Minnesota. That's a huge achievement, and that's one of our very own, Dr. Karanja, a great scientist, and the man behind the screen here is a wonderful robotic engineer. I think if the Kenyan government and the diaspora work to make sure that we use the expertise that we have, I think we should be in a position to speed up the process for the country to be a competitive nation in the world. But that said, though, in a democratic process, they do say that, yeah, you can talk all you want, but in the end, in a democratic process, whoever wins by simple majority is the one who rules. Let's talk about the diaspora voting rights. And Dr. Karanja, you've been at the forefront of working very hard
Right.
to make sure that the diasporans are able to vote. But that has not really translated to reality. What do you think is the problem, and how do we move forward so that we make sure that we participate next year?
Right. Thank you. I've actually engaged with a team of other like-minded diasporans in what we call the Diaspora Technical Working Group that has taken an effort to try and expand our civic engagement and allow us to vote out here in the diaspora. And as in a nutshell, what we have been trying to do in that case is expand the number of polling stations. As you know, the last election in the U.S. where we are at, you only had 2 polling stations, one in, actually 3, one in Washington, D.C., one in New York, the UN office, and the other one in Los Angeles consulate. And yet, most of the Kenyans don't live in either the East or the West Coast. There are a lot of other Kenyans in Dallas, in Minneapolis, and other Kansas City, and other regions of the country, which is really problematic for them to go to those 2 extremes to vote. So what we've been trying to do is, nudge IEBC through various means, including going to court, in order for them to, expand the number of polling stations, not only in the US, but also in Europe and in Asia, to allow for more Kenyans to participate in the election. Whether that is going to happen, I don't know. I think one limitation is that our political class does not want to expend any political energy and political capital in facilitating the diaspora to vote. I think one of those reasons is that we tend to vote anti whoever the incumbent government is. So I don't know if that is a limitation for them to actually pull the lever for us and make sure we vote. But I think the issue of, as I mentioned, political capital, do they want to expend that energy to push laws through parliament, to have IEBC actually deliver on those progressive implementation of the Constitution? Is the executive going to fund IEBC with enough resources to advance the case for the diasporans voting? So I think part of it is, I would say, it's lack of political capital, in wanting to expend political capital to actually make that happen. But for us in the diaspora, we will not tire in trying to push that envelope. Because, so, for example, a country like Rwanda and even Brazil, Rwanda is more up because they are our neighbors, they are part of the East African community. Their diaspora is able to vote, and they vote more broadly than we Kenyans here in the US. So there is a case to be made for us to actually engage, but more so is, do our political leaders want to expend that capital to move that agenda on our behalf? Because we can't, we are here, we have to depend on them on the ground in Kenya to make that happen.
Okay, thank you, Kenny, as always. So politics, as we know it, of course, is emotive. And we talk about politics. I think the simplest definition of politics is acquisition of power and using that power to your advantage. So to be fair, the politicians are using that advantage. So the question, as I bring in Dr. Bogongo, is for the diasporans. The diasporans have power. I mean, they can say, there's that exposure where a number of people have the financial ability to do whatever they want to do and all these things. But when you talk about these things across the diaspora, specific here in the US, whether it's in the predominantly Kenyan centers like in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in Dallas, Texas, in Atlanta, Georgia, or Seattle, you see Kenyans still talking too much politics, but there is no movement towards hey, we have the financial power, we have the exposure, we have the expertise, but there isn't much effort towards unification, towards that goal. Why do you think that is the issue, Edwin?
So our elections tend to be very close, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's estimated that the diaspora will probably have close to 2 million votes. And you said quite rightly that there's always a feeling that perhaps social change, political change, and economic, upward mobility is too slow. And a lot of people are anti-incumbent. So if you're the incumbent, what's your motivation to leverage the legislative and constitutional process to allow diasporans to vote? So there is no, I don't believe that there is inherent motivation in our current setup. And quite frankly, the politicians would also argue that why would we let diasporans change the course of the country and they don't live here, right? So I've had those arguments before. I think to the extent that people in the diaspora can continue to sort of engage at the political level, whether it's involvement in their local, again, you said politics is local. I think it starts from the grassroots, trying to find politicians within our locales that embrace a progressive agenda, especially around eradication of poverty, right sizing our education system, and providing more accessible quality healthcare, and so on. And also a commitment to avoiding government waste. I think a case can be made that we're not really good at not wasting government resources for the common good. So I think the number one, there's just no incentive on the part of the government to do that. I think the second piece is that since this is a constitutional sort of provision, how active have the diasporans been in trying to promote change, right? So outside of being sympathetic to say progressive forces, or in some instances responding positively or negatively to initiatives with the government of the day, in different sectors. I mean, there are people who are happy about one thing and may not be happy with another. I think that engagement has sort of defined the diaspora. So it's about money, and what can you do to improve our sort of. I think we've almost become the top three in terms of foreign direct investment for the country. So, and that's why I think this conversation is very intriguing, because we have to move beyond remittances and say, do we have a strategy as diasporans to say we don't live in Kenya, but we care about our country? How can we engage with like-minded people to say, is there a way we can reset the political conversation, and the attitude towards what a new Kenya could look like?
Right.
Good point. Can you
And
take
maybe
note
to
of
add,
Dr. Bugongo's words? He's using a lot of we's, and there is a reason why I use that we. So not too long ago, I was in Nairobi and I was having lunch with a friend, and we were talking about Kenya, and they told me, hey, nyinyi watu wa majuu, you have no idea what's happening on the ground. So let's talk about the
right.
we that Edwin is talking about. When you think
Mhm.
about the diaspora's involvement in the Kenyan socio-economic and the geopolitical development, right? Is there a we
Right.
in the diaspora? Because people say, yeah, you guys, this politics in the diaspora is too emotional and very powerless. I mean, you see those ones who are for, no disrespect, but for the pro Matiangi, it is the six non-stop, that's it, right? Those ones who are for Gashawa, it's Gashawa, that's it. Those ones who are for Kalonzo, that's it, right? And then those Janice, there's almost no room for reasoning as to why the other party is what it is. So that said, why is it so difficult for us in the diaspora to talk about what Edwin is talking about? We Kenyans, not we
Right.
based on those clans and tribes. Kenny.
Right. Yes, I think that's a very good question, because, as I mentioned, ecumenical. Are we looking in the diaspora? Are we ecumenical? Do we look at Kenya as a whole organism, or do we look at it as, I'm from the mountain, I'm from the lake, I'm from which highland, I'm from which lowland, right? Have we evolved away from that mentality here in the diaspora? That is the question. Or, as they put it, you can take the man out of the village, but you cannot take the village out of the man. So maybe us diasporans have been taken away from our village, but our villages are still in us. I think that is a very good question. And it's something that we in the diaspora should really interrogate. Having lived, and in this case, the United States, knowing how the local politics run and seeing that, there are political tribes in the US, right? So what kind of political tribes are we? As we are community political tribes, but I will argue that we need to move beyond that. Just like we are moving beyond remittances, we really moved beyond that notion of my community, my man, my woman, because as Dr. Bgongo said, taking healthcare as an example, it's everyone who is suffering, and maybe a little creme de la creme at the top that does not feel the pain of the vast majority. So the vast majority needs to know that coming together and looking for leadership that addresses their needs and not addressing the needs of the cream, then at that point we will make a change. But I will proceed at this point. We are a little far away from that ideal, but it is about time that we as the diasporans, again, we look at Kenya as a whole organism and not worry about, where we come from, locally. But to your point, politics is also local. It doesn't mean ignoring where you come from. It just means having a higher understanding, and having that higher understanding really influence your decision, especially on a national level, because we have county governments which allow you to vote your county level governance, grassroots, and then a national level which should, as diasporans, should be thinking of that level as the whole organism level. So I think we have a long way to go, I would say, but yeah, we are getting there. We will get there. Rome was not built in one day, and hopefully 2027 we'll begin seeing some of those fruits. And I know that's a conversation for another day, but that is also a space that the diaspora really needs to think deep and wide about. Yeah, but yes, that I like that. We the diaspora, we.
He said it. I didn't say it. Edwin said it. So let's get back to him. Edwin, who is we? If we're not we, how do we become we?
So I'll give you some interesting sort of perspective. One is, if you look at the Kikuyu diaspora, right? They are probably equal to the number of people that live in Central Province. In other words, they don't live in Central Province. They either scattered around the country or around the globe. I would say the same about the Kambas. I would say the same about the Kisi and so on. It's very important that at a basic minimum, you have good roads, you have good healthcare, good education, independent of where you live in the country. At least we can agree on that as a country, right? And be very protective of those investments, which are the drivers of socioeconomic change, right? And so when I say we, it's about us Kenyans realizing that this obsession with tribal politics is, I would say, it's not only parochial, but it's sad that, how many years after independence, we haven't found that nice lane where we value our citizens based on what they can contribute to our country's movement versus where they come from and what's the spelling of their last name. And so my argument is that in order for us, and I speak to the diaspora here, in order for us to drive this change, we have to be the ambassadors of merit, return to a meritocracy, and argue that all these talented people across the globe can offer something to Kenya. Don't fixate on where they are from, rather value what they bring that can help the country.
But still back to you.
And maybe
go ahead, Ken. Go ahead. Yeah, okay. I
was going to come back to you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point that Dr. Bwonko talked about merit. A lot of us, and this one I might be dating myself, and may the Gen Z listening to this forgive me, but those ones who were brought up in the days of Nyayo and Moi, there was some element of merit. Of course, there were challenges there, but there was some element of merit. You went to a national school, you went to one of 3 universities, there was some of that. And I think that is something that has been lacking. I know the previous government tried to bring that back into the conversation, but by and large, I think that is something we really need to think carefully about. As we know here in the diaspora, we have very high achieving Kenyans. They migrate from Kenya, go to a space where merit is rewarded and appreciated and acknowledged and nurtured, and they shine, they do well. There's no reason that can't be in Kenya. I know we have financial and economic limitations, but still, that could be part of the culture, that could be part of our reasoning and our understanding. And I think at that space, we will have a critical mass that we will start making better leadership choices, hopefully.
Yes, but I'm going to stick with you, Edwin, again, because this is the reality we're living in and on a very daily basis. Quite frankly, no disrespect to our audience, to some annoying level, that even those of us who've been here for 20 plus years, others beyond, and even having kids beyond this age, the fact that we're so divided based on tribes that sometimes people can't even say hi to somebody because of another tribe and because of something that's happened in the country. You two gentlemen are very accomplished in your own rights. If you could look straight to the camera and talk to the diaspora, what do we do to make sure that we are District 47, that tribe is not an issue, that we should together work as brothers and sisters? I want to start with you,
Well,
Edwin.
I don't think there is anything wrong with being attached to your cultural identity. I think it's who we are. We can't run away from that. I would argue that a similar sentiment probably plays out in Kenya, especially the generation of those that lived in their village and then moved to the cities or the urban areas for work. But if you look at their children, including Gen Zs now, they don't really see themselves as tribe first. They look at, I'm part of a community, my neighbor doesn't speak my language, but we have so much in common. I think there's a space for us to have a conversation in the diaspora that we're not vilifying those that are really culturally attached. I think there is value to that because that's how we grew up, and I think if you think about cultural heritage, if you belong to that school of thought, I would not say that that's a bad thing. But I also think that at the same time, when we have been exposed to an environment like, say, the United States, where yes, we live in different states with different orientations in terms of focus, we have learned that there is something magical that happens when you have a common cause. And that common cause is, for the most part, driven by merit. So I would argue that there is a little bit of education that we need to sort of invest in the diaspora to also talk about, while we tell the Kenyan government, let's talk beyond remittance, I think there is probably a room for us to talk about beyond tribe here in the diaspora, respecting that cultural attachments some of them I won't say some. I'd say most of the time. I always say there are cultural realities that we should not ignore.
Matter is that to Edwin's point is that to understand Kenyan politics, you also have to understand tribal politics in Kenya. The reality is the question of numbers
Right.
based on the tribes. And to Edwin's point,
Right.
that's what we have here. But the key question again, if you could talk to the diasporans, and because we talk to the people on the ground, what should we do to make sure that in 2026 going forward, that the conversation around tribe should be beyond us and that we should be focusing on substance? How do we make sure that the infrastructure services in the country is good for us? Because if you ask every diasporan, they've invested in different parts of the country, not necessarily in their tribal places. How do we improve the education section? We have the medical, 60% of our people here are in the medical industry. How do we ensure that the healthcare industry in Kenya is advanced? You are in technology. How do we make sure that Kenya becomes the hub of technology? How do we make sure that we revive the tourism industry? How do we revive the agricultural sector in Kenya? Right? What do you say to the people in the diaspora as we talk to our brothers and sisters home, Kenny?
Right. I will carry on from what Dr. Buonko said and talk a little bit about our communities, our cultures, even our tribes, if you want to use that label. I think the challenge becomes when that connection to that community deprives you of logical reasoning and logical thought and making choices that do not even ascribe to a cultural understanding. So I'll give an example. I don't think there's any community anywhere that values laziness, for example, right? So why should we elect a lazy leader? I'm not saying anyone is lazy. I'm just saying as an example, right? No community says someone should be a thief. So why should we be okay with a leader who is? No community says that someone should be a killer. So why should we accept? So part of our communal upbringing also should inform the choices we make. I think there is a political advantage that is taken advantage of by politicians to make us not even use our own community upbringing as a measure of leadership, because the problems we face, they're the same for all of them. I believe all our communities, they ascribe to the same measures of leadership. Yeah, I've never seen, as I said, a community that wants a lazy leader. So some of those things should also inform our choices in terms of leadership. Now, back to the question of the diaspora, I think I mentioned taking the village out of the man and not taking the village out of the man, right? Let us learn, the diaspora, wherever we are, and in this case, I think we're biased towards America because there are some diasporas that are not democratic, right? But this one is democratic. So learning from that democratic heritage of the spaces where we occupy, that would inform some of the decisions we make. But of course, there's a larger point that we are here. Maybe the challenges that we face are not the same as the ones faced by people on the ground, but we can influence them in their thinking and maybe in the choices they make. So part of it is a two-way street. And another thing we may want to also be cognizant of is that we are almost always the first generation, I would say, diaspora. We are immigrants, really, so we became natural citizens of the countries we are in. But our children may not have the same affinity as we have of Kenya. So if I were a leader in Kenya, I would be like, this, let's take advantage of this time before we get a generation that doesn't really have the same attachment. But for us, I think it's more influencing people on the ground and also behaving that way here in the US, for example, and in the upcoming 2027, projecting that which we think the direction Kenya should be taking, rather than complaining the same thing like our brothers complain in Kenya and behaving the same way here in the diaspora. I think that will be a significant drawback. I would say, perhaps even I would say embarrassing to the diaspora.
Edwin,
Yeah,
Edwin, I want to
can I
bring you
just can I yeah
Edwin, as we transition, there's a point I wanted to. Can just say something then as we transition to you. Can you make a very good point? I didn't see it, but now as he's talking, I'm paying attention to this. If you look at the diasporans who are so vested in Kenya, are those first generation immigrants, right? And if you look at it closely, maybe the spouses care less. Women tend to care not as much. I'm not saying disrespectful, but with the children and others. But then you're talking about our children and that generation. You're saying that generation has no interest in Kenya. And therefore, in the future, in the next decade or two, they pretty much won't have interest in Kenya, which means the Nairobi and the rest of the country will lose a significant constituency. That's a key point to take. If you could, Edwin, add on that, as you do so, also talk about this. The only way we have, as Kenny said, is influence. And the best way we do so is through media. So how should the media platforms, including these ones, use this as a platform to influence the diaspora collective thinking and those back in Kenya? Edwin.
so I think that what Dr. Karanja said is spot on. We might be experiencing the peak of our diaspora engagement with the country because a good number of first generation immigrants care about the country. They want to improve their village, they want to improve their families. Every so often we hear stories of first generation immigrants that unfortunately depart us, and their kids go to the country and sell all their property and return here. So that's a reality that the government has to project, right? And I think that, which is why I feel that there's this room, and it's not an endless window. There's this window that I think the country can leverage this sort of patriotism that we see among first generation immigrants. I do agree with Dr. Karanja that it would not last forever. I think the second piece is really about influence, right? So I'll use Sweden as an example. If you're a politician in Sweden, you get elected because of what you're offering the population. And guess what? When you leave parliament, you get on the bus like everyone else, right? There's a culture of equality and a sense that you're a politician because you feel you have something to offer, and so you serve the community, right? Our political orientation is very different. It's a high stakes political game. Anyone who gets elected expects to have some sort of largesse from selling influence, selling votes. We've had all these stories about how you peddle the influence and reward this and punish that. And I think when that happens, then is people get desperate to stay in office, and then you gravitate to these defensive mechanisms and say, well, I'm doing poorly in the polls because my people, I'm being singled out. Why don't you vote for me? And so the security in tribe becomes a very powerful political tool if you have the means to drive that narrative, right? So they as a country, yes, as I said, I think another generation is gonna come that maybe that becomes has to get eroded. I think the question could be, how conscious are we as a country that that's necessarily is maybe our Achilles heel in terms of being a progressive country. And then the last piece is about influence. I honestly believe that we we don't have to be politicians as diasporans to do good in our communities. I see people who find interesting technologies where they live, they raise money, they go and they make a difference. We've had I'll use an example like an organization called Books for Africa. They find all this, all these books that are need to be donated, and they collect money, they send containers, and they donate to schools so that kids can have a much better perspective of what the world is like through improving their reading and writing. Or you could argue that individuals that take healthcare professionals to go and develop dialysis centers or go do first world surgeries in a hospital like Kisi, where nobody would ever thought that this would happen. I think there is a way that we can show our influence to the citizens where we come from, that it's never really about me and my clan or my tribe, but think about what I can do that serves the common good. I think if we have a relentless sort of orientation around that it's about what we can do for the common good, then I feel, and I don't know, maybe Dr. Karanja has heard of the tragedy of the commons, where on paper you think that we should really care about being our brother's keeper, until we hand the reins of our country to politicians, and then it becomes a game.
Good, good. So you respond that, Kenny, and the same note to talk about this. So last week on this show, I was having a conversation with the leader of opposition in Mozambique, Valencia Mandela, a very young, very articulate guy, and he described his movement as a Facebook movement. So that's what has popularized him. On the same note, on using media as a way of passing the message and influencing, lots of Kenyans in the diaspora are using social media as a way of communicating, whether it's Facebook, WhatsApp group, TikTok, and others. And some of it, quite frankly, has been used very nicely. Yet, in some parts, it hasn't been used very well. The fact that we've traveled the world and got this exposure, what would you say to the diaspora in terms of how we should use media to communicate and communicate effectively? Penny?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Myself and my experience, media has significantly changed. I think Dr. Bogongo, at some point you gave an example of the days we used to write letters and landline phones, phone calls. Those days are long gone. Now we have social media, which comes with, and we haven't even talked about AI, right? That has really revolutionized the way we communicate, for better or for worse. So I remember during Uhuru Kenyatta's first term, right, there was that whole thing of Cambridge Analytica and how they used certain, dark arts to influence the election. I think that is a challenge that still exists today. So and unfortunately, a lot of Gen Zs are in this space. So a lot of information plus misinformation and disinformation. And I'm not a communication expert, so I don't know the nuances between all that. But, media today is a lot more tricky because the veracity of the information you get is not that clear. However, for those who have better designs, these are platforms and tools that can be used to really influence the messaging on the ground. And especially given that the next election, if all these young people register as voters, they will have a significant impact on the election. I think there is a case to be made for a form of curated approach to using all these different social media platforms. But on the same notion, it is also critical for the listener, the one being influenced, to know what kind of information they are consuming, whether it is true or not. So it is a challenge for all of us. For even say this conversation is in the media, right? We're on Facebook and Twitter and other handles, right? So people will have a lot of information. And this is where critical thinking and thinking beyond your community and your tribal inclinations become really important, because that way you can have clarity of thought as to what you want in a leader or what you want in an economy, and really be able to take that step and make the right choice. I think the part of even that media conversation is that person who's the diasporan who will say, why should I care, right? I'm here in the diaspora, Shemejian is having issues. Minnesota is called me, Minnesota. So, so why should I care? So that is also something that we in the diaspora really want to think about. There's some level of apathy in engaging with Kenyan issues as well.
Okay, Edward, respond to the same word, social media. Go ahead, Edwin.
Yeah, so I think social media is the Achilles heel, even in first world countries. It's a hotbed for misinformation. It's it's a counter to mainstream media that is controlled information sharing, and so it's this sort of jungle where it's a double-edged sword, right? You can also misinform people to sort of to the extent that it doesn't serve the common good. I do think that at the end of the day, as we embrace a new world of AI and other generated media, it becomes unpredictable about what is going to be the role of the media. I think the savvy politicians who know how to leverage the media well, and if as a collective diaspora and say we're going to have a trusted source, for example, that actually shares information that's accurate, and somehow you become, I always say that in any political discourse, you cannot always agree. There's always somebody who is for something and against something. But at least an environment where people say, I would say, for example, a lot of Africans really believe that the BBC is a fair media house, right? They listen to it a lot, right? And people used to say, why? Well, you'll hear how they have reported something, and then you read what's been written in the local country's newspaper. You say, well, that's not what I had in BBC. So I think there's an authenticity, I'll call it an authenticity wobble that has to be overcome. I also think there's something that hopefully we have to address before we call it a day. The average age, the median age of the Kenyan population by 2030 is likely to be under the age of 18, right?
Correct.
Today, Africa is the world's youngest continent. And so artificial intelligence is taking away a lot of tasks that I would say are the biggest job creation opportunities for any economy, even in first world countries, right? There's a crisis that's coming ahead. And that is why I say this conversation about going beyond tribe and going beyond political survival, I think is really critical about the fate and the future of Africa's young people, and by extension, Kenya in particular. And so I think the person that really captures the essence of there is a tsunami of young, educated, unemployed African youth coming to their formative years is really, really critical to address. And so I'm hopeful that the diaspora can create that awareness and say, please, Kenya and other African countries by extension, let us step back and see, are we creating a crisis? Do we have the ability to create jobs of the future? And if we're embracing this sort of, I mean, think about it. We're moving towards more of a consumer economy on the African continent, which is, I think, disastrous, because that consumer economy needs these people with well-paying jobs to drive it. And we're saying that those jobs are drying out. Can we go back to the basics, that we need a vibrant workforce? We've talked about meritocracy, and we've also talked about the idea that, at least in my opinion, are we net producers? Are we net consumers? And if we don't address those things, not giving away our raw materials and then buying back things at a super expensive price, creating local capacity, value added sort of capacity around things like tea and coffee and our agroeconomy, and I could go on and on. Think about the minerals that are mined out of the continent. There has to be a conversation about these young people, because if we do
Mhm.
not do a timeout and say we got to change course, then we will have a lot of political turmoil on the continent, and I don't think Kenya will be immune to that.
Okay, sounds good. So before we when move to the last thing we're about to finish here, I think it's good to take that moment to talk to our viewers and say, as we prepare for 2027 and beyond, the best place to get accurate information, expert discussion, and analysis is nowhere but on KDRTV. So, with that said, it's good to request our viewers to go on our social media platforms at this point on KDRTV, subscribe, go on YouTube as well, subscribe, and on TikTok. So that way they're able to follow. And again, with a promise that going forward, these faces will be very common. Dr. Karanja, Dr. Bogongo will be available to engage in serious discussion and analysis on issues Kenya and the diaspora. And also note that at the same point, anybody who wants to come and participate, in as long as it's going to be substantive conversation around the diaspora and around Kenya, you're very welcome to join us in the conversation to make a better Kenya. With that said, as we finish here, we have about 3-4 minutes to finish. You'll be talking about the role of the diaspora in engaging in Kenya and beyond. I'll ask you two gentlemen, what could be the concrete steps that the diaspora should take to make sure that we are well informed to participate, not just in the elections, as Dr. Bogongo said earlier on, but that we participate in the social, economic, and geo development of the country so that we're a competitive nation, not a country that is, we shouldn't envision, quite frankly, to be Singapore. I think that's an insult to our nation that we're thinking of being a Singapore when Singapore and the rest of the world should be Kenya. So, what steps should we take as a diaspora Kenya to be prepared?
Right. I think I have maybe two points to make. One is the comment from Dr. Bogongo. Really, that was quite. Are we consumers or are we generators? Are we creators? I think part of our challenge in Kenya and Kenyans really is that we have been consumers even of knowledge. You consume the comment about Singapore. We are consuming that which has been made by someone else, instead of actually creating that which we want as Kenyans. So my point is, one, let us think of the Kenya that we want, Kenya that we deserve. Let us imagine what that looks like in terms of empathy and equality and development and peacefulness. However we want to think of unity, peace, love, and unity, which is, our motto, right? Think about how does that look for me, for my neighbor, for my community. And then second, effectuate that. Do something to bring that to fruition, to bring that empathy, to bring that peace, to bring that unity into fruition. And I think that way we will start to see a better Kenya, and the diaspora will also be contributing to that better Kenya. But it has to start with you, and then you have to act, not just talk. And Kenyans, we talk a lot.
Okay, same question, Dr. Thanks, Kenny. So, Dr. Bugongo, the same question.
Yeah, I think one can argue that people in diaspora have, and there's obviously evidence how much remittance we send to the country. I think there has to be a sense that let's be creators, right? The government can leverage opportunities for the diaspora. So maybe create special economic zones and say, if you're a diaspora collective, pool your resources, come put for us a banana factory, in Nyanza, all right? Or or go to Western Kenya and we want to value add and create a peanut or cotton factory. I think there's a way we have to think beyond just giving, because I mean a lot of diasporans will say they send money because people are saying the shilling doesn't go very far. If you are aging parents, their pension probably lasts a few days, and it's become more of a sustenance. I don't want to call it a black tax, but I think we can do more than just that. And I feel that one, yes, we should have conversations and as diasporans and say, can we make these bold moves to lead the way by being creators? I think the other piece is the influence we have. So yes, we send money to our families. I think they have a fundraiser at the church. They want you to contribute. They want to know, you know, how can you help the your local primary school and so on. There is a level of influence I think the diaspora can leverage, but that influence has to be from an informed standpoint. So how can we
Mhm.
encourage people in the diaspora? Don't just work, 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 work. Pause and ask the question: do you really understand? If you left Kenya more than 20 years ago and you haven't been back, you might not recognize it, right? The population growth is enormous. The social fabric has really changed how the economy works and so on. Have some sort of grounding on where Kenya is and how it runs, and then ask yourself, what can I do to improve it? Because unless you're in that conversation and that consciousness, it's very easy to just in the diaspora and say, this is a useless government or useless that person, and so then that's not adequate influence. It has to come from a position of knowledge. And then the last thing I can say is that uh, again, when my belief is that elections in Kenya are winner take all, right? So that's what we have created, right? And so if I win the election tomorrow, there's a sense that I worked for it and people liked my vibe. So you gotta eat you needed a chef and that's what I'm cooking. So welcome to my table for the next 5 years, right? I think we have to find
Mhm.
ways, regardless of who gets elected, to accept the reality that elections have consequences. And can we develop a strong diaspora lobby, independent, regardless of who gets elected, from an informed position? I think there is room for us to say, let's have a very strong diaspora lobby that is informed about the drivers of the economy from our perspective, at least. Have some local knowledge about how to navigate this, and invite some more progressive sort of
Mhm.
industrial level investment. That, in my opinion, is I think what the diaspora should be doing.
Okay.
Mhm.
Well, that said, again, we have only 2 minutes to finish up here. I can't help but the text message. Somebody just texted me here and said, "Hey, Dr. Okai, oh my goodness, your guests are very smart and good looking. What keeps going?" That's not my question, Kenny.
Pardon?
Your response to this text.
Oh, what keeps me going?
Yes.
Oh, eating well, exercising, right? A nice cold day like today in Minnesota, and thinking about the future of Kenya that we want, right?
Okay. Good. Good. Thank you, Edwin.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that you at some point you have to make sure you can look at yourself in the mirror and know where your joy is derived, and protect that with
Mhm.
everything. So focus
Right.
on your health, obviously, and don't be afraid to engage in tough conversations. I guess I
Mhm.
think for me. as far as it relates to Kenya, it's really a deep love of country, and knowing that I came from very humble beginnings, and I feel that some kids who would have been me, 50 something years ago, are missing the chance to take the path I took, because we have erased pathways that promote merit, and have become an influence sort of driven system that's keeping very smart Kenyans out of the fold. And I would say that's my eternal prayer, that I go against that narrative.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. With that, as getting at the top of the hour again, the text didn't ask me, but again, getting to know you and being a proud Kenyan in itself keeps me going. So, again, at the top of the
Right.
hour, may I take the opportunity to thank you very kindly, Dr. Karanja, a
Thank
good
you.
friend, and thank you for your expertise and insights. I think our Kenyan diaspora community and the country will forever always be grateful, and obviously will continue to have you here as well. Dr. Edin Mugongo, a great son of ours, a friend. Thank you for coming on. Your insights make
Thank you.
this valuable. And of course, we cannot thank enough the man behind all this. Engineer Ben Kebato is quiet, but again, he does great work. Ben, on behalf of the team here and everybody, thank you. So, for those ones again who are watching us, thank you. As we said, this is going to be an ongoing conversation. And next week, if you could join us at 11 Central, we're going to talk about the implication of the U.S. Iran war in Africa, and we'll be talking with 3 experts from Africa. So Kenya will be represented by Professor David Monda from the University of New York in Albany, and then we also have Mary Horoa. She's at the Center of Democracy in Washington, D.C., and then we also have His Excellency Ambassador Sharif Baldin from Senegal. All these 3 experts will be talking about what the implications of of the current Iran-American war in Africa. So with that said, again, thank you so very much for being with us today. But before you click that button, go on our Facebook page, KDRTV, YouTube, subscribe so that you can always get notifications. Again, thank you very kindly for being with us. Looking forward to being with you again next week. Thank you.